Hello, Sushi Commander. Can you hear me? Just want to test my mic and setup. Awesome. If it's okay, I will try and switch my image feed to make sure that everything works. Oh, actually, never mind. Ill prepared. Let me try that again. Here you go. Let's try it now. All right, I can see it's changing. That's good. All right, I will go grab my tea and we'll be with you guys in a few minutes. All right, let me do a final audio test before we start, just to make sure that everything works. And just wanted to say thank you guys for swinging by on the weekend. This is a repeat of an older stream, and it is happening on the weekend, so it's nice to see that anyone at all was interested in coming. Uh, Before we start, just one quick note. I am not a professional. I'm not a trained or professionally educated paleontologist or geologist. I'm just an enthusiast who likes this shit and tries to dig up some interesting information. So what you see here, if you find something interesting or feel skeptical about it, remember there are lots of resources online and you can look it up and maybe you'll correct me next time. So we are thanks to Commander. So it is noon where I am, so it is time to get this started. Here we go. So life before dinosaurs is today's subject. Just a very quick introduction about what we will cover. We'll start at the creation of our planet, creation of Earth, and we will end at so-called Great Dying. So the major extinction event, the largest in fact, right before the Mesozoic, right before the era of the dinosaurs. And our story starts in the Hadean Eon. This is where it's estimated that our planet first formed, around 4.7 billion years ago. Hadean Eon is a little strange because we are talking about geological periods, but we don't actually have that many geological records from this time period. Not many rocks survived. In fact, almost nothing on Earth. The age of the Eon is mostly estimated by rocks present on the Moon and some of the asteroids. So it's more interpreted from from the geological record to our whole solar system rather than our planet itself. That said, in this hellhole, this is how it looked like. We do have something, and those are zircons. These are the earliest rocks, earliest minerals of Earth that have been preserved. So you can see this is about 350 millions after the estimated formation of the planet is when we get the earliest geological record. That is not life, however, right? You didn't necessarily come here to listen about rocks. You came here to listen about living things and organisms. So let's talk about them, and let's talk about how they got here in the first place. And throughout the ages, there have been a few theories and ideas proposed, and I want to go over a few of them because realistically, we don't have a solid answer. Hi, One Pro Bavarian. It's good to see you here. So, first theory, panspermia. Those of you who played Stellaris might have heard about this one. It's the idea that life has migrated here from outer space. And it's not as outlandish as it might seem at first. This is actual science. Then there are specialists in the field who are focusing on this theory. What gives it credibility is a story of an experiment where some of Earth's most resilient organisms, like the tardigrades, for example. You may know them as water bears, incredibly resistant microscopic organisms. They were taken to the International Space Station, exposed to the vacuum of space and the radiation for a little while, brought back to Earth, and they continued reproducing. So life is a multicellular life is capable of surviving the exposure to the vacuum of space for an extended period. So in theory, if some microbe or basic DNA was dislodged from an alien planet or a moon in our solar system where it could have originated, it could survive long enough to fly to Earth and crash on our planet and continue evolving here. That theory, however, doesn't explore the question, the core of it all, the very idea of how life formed in the first place. And that's where the two other theories come in place. So the one that you probably heard about the most and the longest for a long time is the idea of a primordial soup. This is a term often thrown around, but not necessarily explained in detail. What it means essentially is that the materials essentially I'm lacking a word here, damn English. Let's go with materials, some rocks, minerals was the word I was looking for, present in the water on early Earth, and chemical compounds present in our atmosphere interacted together in a highly energetic environment. Highly energetic, what we mean by that is that early Earth was volatile. There were lots of volcanisms, lots of storms, lots of heat energy, lots of electric energy, and somewhere in that mix of energy and organic and inorganic material, first life originated. That theory held its own for a long while until some of the recent discoveries. And the recent discoveries analyzing the chemistry of rocks from that era, those zircons and some other things, have discovered that the composition of the atmosphere was not one that would have allowed that to happen. So there wasn't enough organic material and not the right kind of material there that would have allowed life to form this way. So primordial soup is actually looking more and more unlikely. However, the kind of chemistry that we are looking for was present in the deep ocean around the areas called geothermal vents. We have geothermal vents on the planet today. They are in the deep ocean. Lots of expeditions go there to examine them. Hello, Manson. It's good to see you. And chemistry there is correct to, in theory, create life. There is heat because the vents generated. Lot of quote unquote nutritious minerals are there also. In reality, we don't know for sure if this is what happened. This is an area of an active research. All those theories, however, while they might explain how life got here, they don't necessarily answer the question of why, right? Why does the universe favor or disfavor or allow the creation of life in the first place? And this is where we go to a different one. This maybe calling it a theory is a little strong of a word. It's more of a hypothesis at this point. There is a gentleman. His name is Jeremy England. You can Google the guy. I will write his name in the Twitch chat, so you can check him out if you want to hear a little more about his ideas. And what Jeremy England proposes is that it is not the biology and chemistry that is responsible for the emergence of life, but the whole idea of evolution goes back down to the basic physics of our universe. And his theory comes down to what we call entropy. So, hey, which streamer? I will now very quickly try to explain what entropy is in layman terms that I also am capable of understanding. So, when you think about entropy, I want you to think about a bonfire, right? There is some wood you put into a pile, you set it on fire, and it generates energy, right? It dissipates it. Dissipate is the word we are looking for. And that energy wasn't lost. It got scattered in the universe, and now it is more entropic more chaotic because you can't put it back into its original form. So entropy and dissipation are processes we see in the universe all the time, and all matter essentially moves towards entropy. Planets get destroyed, stars burn through the fuel. The energy is still there, but it is scattered. And what Jeremy England proposes is that since the universe seems to follow the laws of entropy and in fact is quote unquote willing to go in the direction of total universal entropy, what is interesting is that organic matter is actually better at dissipating energy than inorganic matter is. So his proposal is that if you shine light long enough at a rock, it will grow legs. Essentially, he has created a physical calculation that in his mind proves that not only is life allowed, but given enough time and energy, all inorganic matter will eventually quote unquote evolve into organic, because the universe favors entropy and organic matter is more favorable to entropy in itself. This seems a little, outlandish maybe. Reality is there is no way to test it right now. They are creating some very promising mathematical models and simulations in the various they are testing in various computers, and from what I have read, there are some promising results initially, so maybe they are onto something here. We will have to wait and see. Reality is the abiogenesis, so the first formation of life, is still an unknown to us. We don't have a definite answer to it. But no matter how life got here in the first place, it did eventually. And where we find the earliest evidence of life on Earth is in the Archean Eon. So right after Adian, we enter this eon, and the earliest fossil is this. So some very basic microbes around 3.5 billion years ago. Um, it's probably reasonable to expect that they occurred somewhere a little earlier, but again, geological record is very poor from this era. It is difficult to find rocks that come from this time. But once life got here, it was here to stay. And one of the first successful um, organisms were of course microbes, and microbes are colonial animals in a sense. One of the structures that you might know is a stromatolite colony. Lots of different forms of bacteria form together to create those molds. In texture, they are kind of cement-like, and I'm talking about the texture because once those things got here, they stayed. We still have them here today. This is the coast of Australia, where you have quite an abundant stromatolite colony. Um, what is interesting about them is that stromatolites are one of the reasons why we have oxygen on Earth at all. Here we enter the Proterozoic eon, so the third eon on our planet. And specifically the bacteria that generated oxygen were called the cyanobacteria. They have pioneered the process you know as photosynthesis. It's what we have today in our plants. The Great Oxidation Event is cool because we like oxygen. Breathing is fun. Initially, it mostly filled the oceans. The order of oxygen actually being absorbed into our planet's environment is ocean was first, then it got absorbed into the rocks, then into the atmosphere. So while there was oxygen in the ocean, there wasn't that much in the air. You would still suffocate in the air because you wouldn't be able to breathe anything. Now, oxygen is great, but not to everyone. So the Great Oxidation Event is also known as the Great Oxygen Catastrophe. It has caused a few things. First, it was a mass extinction, the first one that we are sure of. Most of the bacteria and life organisms inhabiting our planet at that time, they didn't breathe oxygen. They breathed mostly methane present in our atmosphere. So you pump out oxygen, it turns out it's toxic to them, and most of them die off. So there is huge die-off of microbes at this time. Even the Earth itself has trouble coping with this amount of oxygen. It's very likely that there was lots of oxidation going on with lots of various geological structures on the planet. There was probably lots of rust, so the planet probably turned a little red at first, probably a little green, and another side effect was that once you pump oxygen into a methane-rich atmosphere, that oxygen binds methane. And here is what happens. This is early Earth. Sun is young, it isn't highly energetic, there isn't much CO2. Methane is the gas that keeps us warm. So when you remove methane, it gets cold. And so you get the Huronian glaciation. This is the first of the episodes that you probably know of as the Snowball Earth. There were multiple of them. This is the first one and arguably the most severe Ice Age episode in our planet's history. It lasted for about 300 million years. So quite an extended period of time. The whole planet was covered in ice. And this chaos, essentially, of the oxygenation took a little bit of time to stabilize. What returned the planet to the equilibrium. Sushi Commander, that is accurate. We are all breathing bacteria farts. That is 100% the scientific term. What helped the planet get out of this grip of permanent ice sheet was volcanism. right? So volcanoes pump out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Of course, they do it slower than we do nowadays, but they still do it. So over the course of 300 million years, they were able to pump out enough greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to end the ice age. And after that, we got to a planet that looked a little bit like that. And if you look at it and think, this doesn't look too exciting, you are probably right. It is formally known as the boring billion. So 1 billion years of not really much exciting shit happening. You can see it on the chart here. The boring billion is outlined. We had the great oxidation event. First, eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are the kind of bacteria that later become multicellular life, but aren't that yet. Wish to Tatooine? Yes, but actually colder. So our sun wasn't that strong back then yet, and well, there was just the one. What you might see that is interesting in this chart, at the top you have these names, Nunia supercontinent and Rodinia supercontinent. So the boring billion is set between the formation of two supercontinents. So Pangaea wasn't the first supercontinent that we got. Nunia was first, Rodinia was second, and Pangaea will come later. However, there is one interesting thing that happens during the boring billion. So when you are a living organism and you have 1 billion years to kill time, what do you do? Well, you have sex, right? This is roughly around the time that scientists estimate sexual reproduction came into effect. And sexual reproduction, aside from being pretty fun, has its practical benefits also, which is that it allows organisms to mutate more efficiently. And when they mutate, they become more diverse, and the more diverse they are, the more resistant life is as a whole to rapid changes in the environment, right? Some organisms have mutated in one way, some in the other. Something bad happens, kills half of them, but other half remains because they received a beneficial mutation. So this is really the beginning of an accelerated period of evolution, the invention of sex. Now, at the end of the boring billion, in what we call the Tonian period, between 1 billion years ago to 720 million years, we have what is first animal, right? This is Otavia antiqua, as the proper term. It's microscopic. It's about the size of a grain of sand, but it is a multicellular organism. It looks a little bit like a turd, which maybe you wouldn't want your earliest ancestor to look like that, but it is what it is. And what it is a proto-sponge. You know sponges. So this is where their evolutionary line and ours really begins. After that, once multicellular life is on the planet, it is ready to go out and conquer the world, but it runs into a problem, which is the cryogenian period. This is one of those other snowball Earth episodes. And in fact, it's two. It's two separate global glaciations. It starts with the Sturtian glaciation 715 million years ago, and it lasts for about 35 million years. And again, volcanoes come into effect. They get rid of the ice, and once the ice subsides, we get this in the interglacial period. These are algae, and why I'm talking about the algae are quite important to this story, because when you are a tiny microbe, tiny organism, algae are technically macro food, so they are big food. You can't eat this shit unless you grow, but there's lots of material out there, and since life evolves, there is something that is going to take up that niche. So animals that were tiny so far, the size of a grain of sand, they begin to grow. So just as they begin to grow, back under the ice they go again. So this is another Snowball Earth episode, again in the cryogenian period. This one is called Marinoan glaciation. So again, this one 25 million years. Both of those, just to be specific, they were not as severe as the Turonian glaciation. You can see in the picture here, there's this narrow band of exposed water around the equator. There was probably a little bit of exposure to the water. maybe not the whole year round, but in the summer it probably melted a little bit, and uh, basically allowed the sun to enter the water. So one proud barbarian asked, what's with these climate reruns? What you will find in the stream and some of the others, if you come and watch them, is that nothing in evolution is original, and nothing in geology is too. Everything repeats, everything is a rerun of a rerun. Everything is a repost, essentially. So life on Earth has cycles. They come partially due to the activity of the sun, influence of some other cosmic phenomena, and sometimes you can fault life on Earth, right? So we are still theoretically in a glaciation period now. So, same as before, you get volcanoes get rid of ice, and once the cryogenian period ends, we get this, multicellular life, this time done properly. So this is the Ediacaran period. It's the end of what we call the Precambrian period. Precambrian is so-called super eon. So it's a combination of all the eons from the creation of Earth until the Cambrian. So we are nearing the end of that build up to the actual complex life. Now, I want you to take a look at this picture and just realize some things. Most of the things that you are looking at here are not animals and they are not plants. They are something else. Ediacaran is a little odd. It experiments with organisms that don't necessarily belong anywhere on our tree of life. So let me tell you a little bit about it. What Ediacaran organisms are dependent on are so-called microbial mats. Those things will be very important to what happens at the end of this period, so hear me out. Those green things you see, this isn't grass, there are no plants, these are algae and other microbes that cover the whole floor of the sea. What is important to know is that nothing burrows at this point. Burrowing animals didn't evolve yet. So all the life just slithers around the surface here and just eats whatever is under its feet. Although there are no feet here yet also. And as long as there are microbial mats, life flourishes. What is also worth noting here is that nothing swims in those waters. There is some discussion on whether, how do you call those things? Medusa? I don't know how it's called actually, jellyfish. Yes, so there are some discussions about whether jellyfish originated in the Ediacaran or Cambrian. We know definitely they were in the Cambrian. They might have been in the Ediacaran, but we aren't sure. So in highest likelihood, life actually occupies a very narrow band. It gets as tall as 2 meters in the case of some organisms, and it doesn't get underground and it doesn't swim above the seafloor. Here you have an example of some of the weird organisms that live there. I won't be getting into too much detail about all of them. What I want you to look at is this boy. I'm hoping you can see my cursor, where I'm moving it. So this is called Charnia, and Charnia is a pretty interesting organism. It is, again, not an animal, not a plant. It is its own thing. Its body plan is that of a fractal. So it's not actually symmetrical. You might look at it and think that this is like a feather, that there is a right to left symmetry. But really, it's just one structure copying itself into a bigger structure. And it is a filter feeder. It would just stand there. It would get about 2 meters tall, and it would just absorb nutrients from the water. What you see here is an animal, but most of those things are not. And now we get, to a few examples. This slide is particularly interesting because it tells us about what was the main evolutionary drive in the Ediacaran, and that was the body plan. What you see on the right and in the center, so Charnia, Fractophusus, so they are so-called rangiomorphs. So those are the things that grow like fractals. You can see it a little better on the right. You can see there are patterns repeating themselves. On the left, you have organisms called Trilobozoa. And you can see that the symmetry there exists, but it's a bit different. The one on the top is a three-sided animal. The one here has four sides. Here we have six, three again. So there is no bilateral body plan, which is a little odd because all life nowadays has symmetry. Well, all microcellular life nowadays has a bilateral body plan. There is left and right side. Yes. So, sorry, I wanted to point out just one. This one is named after Barack Obama, like seriously, and it has seven-sided symmetry. So Obamus coronitis is the name. Obama has a Trylobozoa organism named after him. Now, we have actual animals present here too. Icaria wariuta, the one at the top left, is most likely one of our earliest ancestors. At least this is the earliest bilateral animal that we know of. Just a basic worm-like creature that slithered in the mud and ate those microbial mats that were present in the Ediacaran. On the top right, you see Dickinsonia. This was previously assumed to be our ancestor. I, for one, am glad we are not descendant from an animal named like this. And the two animals at the bottom are two candidates for the ancestors of trilobites. We aren't actually sure which of them, if either, because maybe there is something else we didn't discover, will lead to the evolution of the arthropods. So the group of animals that are responsible for spiders, crustaceans, insects, all that stuff. As the Ediacaran ends, we enter the Cambrian period. This is also the beginning of the Phanerozoic Eon, so the Eon we live in today, and the Paleozoic era. Paleozoic era is the era of life between Cambrian and the Great Dying, so before the dinosaurs. And as we enter Cambrian, it needs to be said what happens to the Ediacaran. And what happens is digging, burrowing. This is where the burrowing animals emerge first, at the beginning of the Cambrian, and the burrowing completely devastates the microbial mats. As the soil gets turned over and mixed and digested and moved around, microbial mats can't be sustained and they disappear. And once microbial mats disappear, so do organisms that are dependent on them for survival. So this is actually an extinction event. All those rangiomorphs, Trylobozoa, they disappear, and what we are left with are proper animals and plants. And one of the culprits responsible for that is one of the early worms, or rather worm relatives. The Cambrian worms are a little funky, a little different to what we are used to calling worm. This is Falcivermis, so yes, those worms have eyes. They have what looks a little bit like legs, and it has a thick butt. You can see it at the bottom left here. It actually uses it to hook itself in the ground. It builds this kind of weird shell around itself. It hides in it, and then it emerges to just capture some stuff flying around in the water. Here are some other pictures of it. You can see on the left how it would look like maybe when it was hooked. On the right, another image of it. And this is how it's speculated it would move around when it tried to relocate from one place to another. So that thick butt would probably be a little bit of a drag and could make moving around a little difficult. But the animal that the Cambrian is best known for are trilobites, right? You know, those armored flat boys with spikes. So let's talk about them, because those things will dominate the fossil record throughout all of Paleozoic era, and it needs to be understood why. So first, they are armored. What you need to understand at this point that no animal can actually bite. There are no jaws. There are no spikes, no stuff like that. Predators are used to eating soft-shelled animals. Gwen, I want all those trilobites. I mean, Moa. I want all your 500 trilobites. Aside from just having body armor, we know they actually use the same defensive tactic as hedgehogs do today. So they curled up. We have lots of fossils of them curled up in a defensive posture. The other thing that allowed them to survive is sheer diversity. If you just compare numbers, today, a number of living mammals is about 5.5 thousand. That we know of course. Known trilobite species in the fossil record already number about 20,000 species. And this is a low estimate because we know that there are lots of we didn't find fossils for. Many of them didn't get fossilized, yes? So there are tons of them. And when you are so widespread and so dominant in the environment, inevitably statistics dictate you will survive for a long time. Another adaptation are legs. This is cutting edge technology in the Cambrian. Legs around them to burrow themselves in the sediment. And complex eyes. Eyes evolved before trilobites. Jellyfish have eyes, very basic ones. There are eyes that essentially have an light and dark sensor. They can just tell them whether it's light dark when it's time to move up the column of water to eat some stuff, when it's time to go down and hide. Trilobite eyes are more complex. In fact, they are better than your eyes in some ways. They see spectra of light that you don't. And another thing, they are generalist feeders. And unlike us, it turns out that in evolutionary terms, eating trash is good for you, because it means when you run out of food, you will still have something to eat, and you are not a picky eater. So, now that we know trilobites are here, let's talk about some other stuff. Some of them you probably saw here and there. They are fairly famous animals for Cambrian creatures. Hallucigenia is one of those worm-like animals. Opabinia is a very basic semi-predatory probably animal. It's a relative of shrimp. Wiwaxia, I have no fucking idea what it is, and I don't think any scientists do either at this point. We have some other things that you probably have not heard of. On the left, Herpegoaster, that looks like a tree. On the top right, Vetulicoa. Vetulicoa is not a fish, nor is it an ancestor of fish. It looks like one. And earlier today I said that nothing in nature is new, that everything is a rerun of a rerun, and this is a proof of that too. Vetulicoa is an animal that has developed a fish body plan before fish emerged in the fossil record. They don't survive, however, and they go extinct. On the bottom right, Marella is an arthropod, so relative of crustaceans and insects, and a close relative of trilobites. We have some funky worms also, like Capinatator. Is a worm that has only one orifice, that is both its mouth and a butthole, and it's full of teeth. So take from that what you will. And I don't know if that's a better option than the one on the right, because Odontogryptus has actually two mouths that are also both excretion organs at the same time. So yeah, the Cambrian gets pretty kinky with the worms. There are some others, like the one on the left. This is one that was actually probably capable of swimming. It used those weird hair-like appendages, or whatever you want to call them, to move around. And on the right, you see what is essentially still an attempt to experiment with the body plan a little bit. This is a relative of sea stars, Heliocystis. And you can see this is actually a 5-sided symmetry of a body plan. You can see it better visible here at the area that I suppose might be a mouth or a butt. In the Cambrian, you can never be sure. There are some other interesting things, like the hyolith on the bottom left is a relative of clams that we have today. Again, a little more complex than what we actually get nowadays. And on the right, you might not see it immediately, but this is actually an animal that swims upside down. So it lies on its back, its legs are exposed, like pointing upwards, and it curls around here. This is its head and its eyes, right? Here are its legs, here is its tail. So it kind of swims a little bit like otters nowadays when they lay on their back and eat food while in the water. There are also some very early examples of relationships between animals. What you see on the left is a worm that could potentially have been in a symbiotic relationship with sponges. You can see it carries colonies of some of them on its back, and on the right you see what is hypothesized to be an earliest example of parasitism. So this worm-like creature is hooked onto a jellyfish and swims around on its back. Now, I want to tell you about a different animal, and it's actually going to be a story of 3 different animals. First, here on the bottom left, discovered in the 19th century, are things that scientists at that time thought were shrimp. early shrimp, because we have them in the fossil record in the Cambrian. On the right, what was assumed to be a jellyfish, because the body plan fits. And this thing, scientists thought was some sort of weird sponge, right? You can see there's almost 100 years in discovery between those three different organisms. And when they were put together, at first, scientists thought, this is interesting. They are in the same geological strata and close to one another. We probably have an idea of an ecosystem, right? So shrimp hanging around, a sponge, some jellyfish swimming around. Pretty interesting sight. But in reality, those were body parts of a single animal. Those things in the bottom left were gripping appendages. The thing they thought was a jellyfish was a mouth. And the sponge-like structure was a body. And this thing was actually an apex predator in the Cambrian. And this is the rise of predation, really. Cambrian has innovated in that sense. So we get first true predators, and that animals, as Anomalocaris. You probably heard about it. It is also a shrimp relative. You can see here a nice animation of how it likely moved around. You can see those two appendages, right, at its mouth. That's what scientists initially thought were shrimp. The body is what they thought was the sponge. The mouth is here. It actually had additional gripping appendages to help it feed, and it was the apex predator of its era. It was about 1 meter long, which for the longest time scientists thought was as large as life got in the Cambrian, because this was still very early, right? And you wouldn't expect for life to grow too big. There were some other Anomalocaris relatives. Anomalocaris are actually a group of animals. So Tamisiocaris is also one, but this one is not predatory. It is actually a filter feeder. So those appendages have evolved in a completely different way, and extended them, captured whatever it was swimming through them, and just moved them back to its mouth. At least that's how it's been reconstructed for now. Now, again, for the longest time, until very recently, the thought was 1 meter is as big as it gets in the Cambrian. However, in the words of a classic, Qui-Gon Jinn, in the episode 1, Phantom Menace, there is always a bigger fish. And so there was. It wasn't a fish, it was a worm that we has a pet name called the death worm. And Omnidens is about 2 meters long, so twice the size of Anomalocaris. It was slightly predatory also. Unlike Anomalocaris, it occupied a different niche though. It was sediment predator, right? So it probably didn't swim around very much. It instead focused on eating whatever was hiding in the sediment at the bottom. You can see some other pictures here on the right, comparison to a human hand. What needs to be said is that while you probably wouldn't want to wrangle with this thing, its bite wouldn't probably be very dangerous. We have skeletons. Animals in the Cambrian didn't have to contend with internal skeleton until very late in the Cambrian, so it probably wouldn't be able to actually bite through your finger, but it could probably wound you pretty badly, however. Here you can see it actually had some spikes on those head appendages. It might have used them to hold down prey while it was eating them, or maybe it used them for mating purposes to hold on to its partner, or maybe to dig in the sediment. We really aren't that sure. Here you see another picture of how it might have fed at the bottom. So a little bit like a dune sandworm, really. It's a pretty cool animal. I love it. Now, I talked to you just a moment ago about skeletons, and the beginning of a skeleton system starts with this animal. This is Picaia. This is potentially one of your early ancestors. It's a so-called chordate. Chordates are animals with a cord going through its back, the cord that will later evolve into a spine. And as we get Picaia at the very end of the Cambrian, right after it, we get what is likely the earliest fish. So the evolution line of fish begins at the very end of the Cambrian with the Haikyoichthys, bloody Japanese. What about the surface though? Like, we know that there was lots of interesting stuff in the ocean in the Cambrian. What about on the ground? Well, not much. First of all, there is still very little oxygen, even though there were oxygen producing animals on the planet for a long time. Like I told you previously, most of oxygen first gets captured by the water, later by the rocks, and only then the air. So there isn't much air to breathe in the atmosphere outside of the water yet. And there aren't plants out there either. So if you get beached on the surface, this is it when waves toss you out of the water. When it comes to plants, you probably had some algae present in the wet sand at the shores of some shallow seas, but this was most likely it. So at the end of the Cambrian life, mostly contained to the water, here you have a picture of how a shallow Cambrian reef could have looked like. And before we move on from the Cambrian, I just want to give you a very simple reading recommendation. Oh shit, I just realized I messed up animation here. Cambrian Ocean World, if you want to read a little more about how life looked like back then, I really recommend it. Now, moving on from the Cambrian, we get into the Ordovician. So in the Cambrian, this explosion of life, you probably heard about it. It's called the Cambrian explosion, right? And we had two. First, in the Ediacaran, we had the Avalon explosion. In the Cambrian, we had the Cambrian explosion. And in the Ordovician, we get the combo breaker. We also have a diversification event, and it is called the Great Diversification Event, right? Yes, Terranas, it's a deep fake. So Ordovician period, of course, trilobites are still present, and in fact, in the Ordovician, you get the biggest trilobite that we know of. It's called Isotellus rex, because of course, if something is big, it needs to be called rex. Its size here compared to an umbrella, because what else? It's 72 meters long, so pretty big. It's a pretty big animal. There are some trilobite relatives. This is not a trilobite. Main difference is that its symmetry actually goes two ways. It has the typical bilateral body plan, but it is also symmetrical in the other way. So its back and front are actually copies of each other in some sense. And its name is interesting. So it was not 72 meters, 72 centimeters. God damn it. This animal is named after the place it was found in. It was found in China, and it was the only animal found in its geological strata. So what other name to give it but Han Solo? Han, in theory, after a Chinese dynasty, the scientist who has named it denies any relationship to a Star Wars character. But who believes him anyway? Now, there are some other trilobites swimming around the Ordovician Sea. And this is the emphasis on the word swimming, because in the Cambrian, they were not able to do that. They would just move around the surface. Here, some species have evolved that capability. Unfortunately, I don't have a better, clearer picture, so this is as good as it gets. However, what is the dominant life form, the apex predator of the Ordovician, are not trilobites, and they aren't shrimp anymore either. What you see on the top right there in the shadow is what actually has grown to be the apex predator, and we'll talk about them now. They are called the cephalopods, so the ancestors of squids, octopuses, nautiloids, animals like that, soft-bodied creatures with multiple gripping appendages who worship Cthulhu. Aside from them, we have a few other animals that emerge at this point. We have snails, so-called gastropods. We have, of course, more trilobites. We have corals. So reefs in the Cambrian weren't actually composed of corals, they were composed of sponges. We have true corals in the Ordovician. And my favorites, those of you who saw some of my other streams, you know I love crinoids. So we have crinoids here. They are relatives of sea stars. You see they're attached to the surface of the sea by the scourge here, and then there is a body here. They are filter feeders, so they use those feathery-like appendages to catch whatever swims through the through the sea. And crinoids are great survivors. They look pretty alien to you, but they're actually alive today also. They are just not very widespread, so it's not easy to find them. But going back to cephalopods, I said they are the apex predators in the Ordovician seas, and no animal proves that more than this one, Endoceras. Uh, you might notice I have added a second name here. It actually used to be two animals that later got reclassified as a single one. So Endoceras is the largest cephalopod in the Ordovician seas, and this is how big it got. So almost 8 meters. Um, so essentially anything that swam in the water at that time would have been food to it. It probably would have been able to kill you also. I mean, it wouldn't need to even be able to bite through your bones. It would just grab you and drag you underwater and suffocate you. So this thing would have been an actual threat to a human being. What is a little different about it compared to modern squids is that first it has this weird face armor, right? Some nautiloids have it too, but they use it in a different way. And second, its arms, its appendages, don't have hooks. Hooks didn't evolve at this point yet. Modern octopuses have them, but not Endoceras. But it didn't really need it. It had 8 manipulative arms that it used to squish other animals, and a beak that it used to bite or rather crush some other animals. There were some other cephalopods here, of course, also. I don't want you thinking that all of them had straight shells. The first cephalopods actually did start this way, but later on, starting in the Ordovician, they started curling their bodies and turning it into this more snail-like form that we know them from today in the form of nautiloids, which survived until this day. There were some other animals. This is where we have the origins of sea scorpions. So those are called eurypterids. They are not true scorpions. First of all, they are bigger. Second, their spike. First, not all of them have a spike, and second, that spike is not venomous, right? Doesn't have a poison in it. When it comes to their size, they get pretty big, but I want to be clear, most of those are not Ordovician ones. The one on the left you see is the Ordovician, but just to be clear, those are not the apex predators. They are like the second level predators in the Ordovician. The dominant animals are still cephalopods. So this boy here would have been prey to the cephalopods. We have some other things. Anomalocarids are still around. So one of them is a Gyrocassis. This is probably the largest anomalocarid and the largest shrimp we have in the fossil record. Harmless. It is a filter feeder, so it wouldn't have posed any threat. We also have fish. They started in the Cambrian. They are here in the Ordovician, and what is interesting is that those fish have armor. This group of armored fish is called ostracoderms. So they are the jawless armored fish. There will be armored fish with jaws later that we'll talk about in more detail, but first we have those. And those are tiny animals. They are just a few centimeters to maybe like 20 centimeters long. So they mostly just sift through the sediment looking for some soft-bodied animals to eat and eat whatever floats by them in the water. Speaking of fish and weird shit, we have conodonts, one of the early fish relatives. Technically fish themselves, but very distantly related to what we have here. Conodonts are super interesting for a few reasons. One, they are the first animals to experiment with a snake-like body plan. Hey Benjamin, yes, demon fish. They get up to 1 meter long, but most of them are shorter. They have huge eyes, and of course those weird mouths, right? What is interesting is that you have to remember there are no jaws at this point among any of the animals. So the way they actually use those teeth, they have muscles that probably just grind those teeth against one another, and that's how they eat. And those teeth are actually pretty fucking scary. They are in fact the sharpest teeth we know of in the fossil record. What you are looking at here on the right are conodont teeth on the head of a pin. On the left, you see the a comparison to what isn't a piece of grass. This is a human hair. So you could literally split human hair with those things. That's how sharp they were. And in fact, scientists who are tasked with removing them from the rock layer have been known to cut themselves pretty badly on those things. Another innovation in the Ordovician, we have the first confirmed presence of land plants. They are very basic at first. Those are just mosses and liverworts. At this point, I should point out that first, those things are not found in the fossils themselves. What is found are their spores. I talked about spores in a different stream that I made. Spores are super hardy and preserve very well, and it's based on the spores that we're able to reconstruct the presence of those two types of plants on the surface. And the second thing that needs to be said is that some genetic research that I don't want to get too deeply into suggests that the origin of land plants might actually go back further into the late Cambrian somewhere. But reality is we have found no proof of that yet. So for the moment, the earliest confirmed presence of land plants is in the Ordovician. Now going to the end of the Ordovician. This is a weird picture, I know. It is difficult to find an image that portrays Ordovician ecosystem at its whole. So this is why I use this picture of an aquarium. But it shows the relationship well. There are some fish swimming in the background. There is this competition between sea scorpions and cephalopods. Cephalopods win, of course. They are massive apex predators living in those shallow waters. Now, there is a very interesting book that I would also recommend you all check out. It's called A Sea Without Fish. That is not technically accurate because I just told you there were fish in those waters. But if you want to read about Ordovician and those weird Cthulhu-like animals, you can check it out. Now, life went through 3 different diversification periods. It's doing pretty well. So it looks like a good time to fuck it up a little bit. And so we come to the Earth and Ordovician extinction. This is the first of what we know as the 5 great mass extinction. You already know there are smaller extinctions, like the one at the end of the Ediacaran. It is not classified as one of the great 5, but was an extinction nonetheless. Those things are much more serious. Now, the likely culprit of this extinction is glaciation. There are 2 theories for what could have caused it. One, continental drift that has changed the way sea currents moved around the planet, and that probably caused a climate change. Second, plants might be to blame. So plants, when they first emerge on the ground, they grow over the rocks, and rocks previously didn't have to deal with that. So rocks have lots of minerals that weren't released into the water previously, and the chemicals and minerals and compounds that are released into the atmosphere and the water based on the interaction between plants and rocks could have actually benefited to the drop in the global temperatures and started the Ice Age. There is also a popular theory that people like to talk about on the internet that I need to kill here. Some people suggest this was a gamma ray burst. There is no evidence of that. First of all, if it was a gamma ray burst, it would have impacted one side of the planet more severely than the other. We would have seen that in the fossil record globally. We don't. And second, the pace of dive would have looked differently than what we get here. It would have been more rapid. Now, why is glaciation bad to the Ordovician? The main reason is that oceans are very shallow at this point. There isn't much elevation in the Earth's crust yet, so it doesn't get very deep. And where it gets deep, there isn't that much oxygen yet. As you remember, oxygen is still propagating throughout our environment. So where oxygen is are shallow seas. And what happens when you get ice? You get a sea level drop, right? Nowadays we are dealing with something that is the opposite of that. It gets hotter, ice melts, we get more water. Then it got colder, water froze, sea level dropped, and it essentially started beaching those animals on the surface. The range of livable environments has shrunk, and this was very bad. It's actually the second worst extinction in history. Only the end Permian extinction is worse. In terms of the percent of extinct species, this is worse than the 8th Cretaceous, than the impact of the asteroid that happened then. So 85 of all Ordovician species go extinct. But what is interesting about this extinction is that despite that, no major groups actually die out. So cephalopods get hit very heavily, but some of them survive. Trilobites get hit very heavily, but some of them survives. Brachiopods like clams, also fish, and all that stuff, they feel the impact, but some species survive and will carry on those lineages. That said, like I mentioned a moment ago, second worst extinction. And following that fallout, we get into the Silurian. Silurian is pretty interesting in that it is often considered pretty boring, and I don't necessarily agree. It is the shortest period of the Paleozoic, but it has 3 extinctions in it. They are all small extinctions, they impact different groups of animals, but what is challenging for life is because it gets hit all the time in the Silurian, it can't really innovate that much. It gets constantly pushed back and back and back. So what ends up being the dominant life form in the Silurian is an animal that we saw in the Ordovician previously, which are eurypterids. Sorry, before I switch on. So those sea scorpions you see here on the left. Fish are there, so are cephalopods, but they are the prey of the eurypterids at this point. You can see how the relationship has changed. You see a cephalopod on the right. It is much smaller. It is here next to a fish and some crinoids. So far from the position they held in the Ordovician. There is some innovation going on with the shape of their shells. So again, they are curling. They're getting a little fatter in some places, but they don't select for size anymore. There are a few big ones that survive into the early Silurian, but like I said, there are 3 extinctions happening throughout the period, so eventually they get killed off by all of them. Here are some of the sea scorpions you get in this time period. Jacalopterus is the largest of them all. It is over 2 meters long, so it is bigger than a human. You can see it here hunting for a fish. They are free swimmers, so they didn't just walk around the seabed. This is also where we get the famous scorpion stinger. Although at this point it is unlikely that they were venomous, but they probably helped scorpions capture fish and kill it while it was struggling. This is also the time where we get first land animals. They are not our ancestors, they are arthropods, so ancestors of insects, crustaceans, all that stuff. The earliest we know is Euthycarcinoid. What is interesting about it is that we know it from trace fossils, so this isn't a skeleton or a print of the animal in a rock. We know it from its footprints. We can firmly associate with other animals that were present in that time period that we have found in the water. So, and we know for sure that it left those marks on a rock that was exposed in the air. And right after it, we also get some sea scorpions, which move to the surface. So those animals that were trying to escape from the water, they are followed very closely. Brontoscorpio is very sizable. I just want to make it clear that the reconstruction here is not necessarily accurate. It is here to show the size of the animal, but really it looked more like this. Here you see some sea scorpions moving into fresh water estuaries, a little deeper into the land, and you see some life out there on the surface, right? What you're looking at here, those pointy things, are prototaxites. I promised my friend from work today I would talk in a little more detail about them. What prototaxites are fungi. They are up to 9 meters tall. So they are the largest terrestrial life form in this time period, much larger than any other plant. What is interesting about them is that they were found with burrows in them, so lots of terrestrial insects probably use them as habitats. So they would just dew in them and eat them, and they would also have a good piece of shelter. It is speculated that in fact this parasitism from insects is what eventually would lead to their extinction. We have some other plants here too. They are the first vascular plants. Vascular meaning they are capable of pumping water from the ground level upwards. So those were the ancestors of trees, and they start growing higher. That said, they are not as tall as prototaxites. Cooksonia, that you saw here and you see in this picture, is up to 1 meter tall. So it would have reached about your like a chest level or your stomach, and wouldn't get much higher. There is no grass. Grass is millions and millions of years away. There are no flowers, no stuff like that. There are some land animals in the form of arthropods, and here we get first arachnids. Very small, but personally I dislike the small ones more because you can't see them coming. So Paleocarinus is one of them. Here you have two different renditions. You can choose which one keeps you out more. We Aside from spiders, we also have centipedes that we have found. I don't have. I'm so sorry, which trainer. Tyrannus, why he fat though? I mean, because he can eat anything he wants. There are no humans to tell him to take care of himself yet. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures of centipedes from that era, but they were found in the fossil record from the Silurian also. But going back to the water, most of the action still goes underwater, and one of those interesting arthropods is this one, Aquilonifer. You can see it has tons of legs, so this is actually a relative of centipedes. And those weird things attached to it, like on a string that you see here, are not actually some weird body parts, but what are suspected to be actually its offspring. So it was carrying babies attached to it all the time. So talk about a gilded cage, right? We also get more interesting cephalopods like Phragmoceras, pretty cute. And we get more crinoids. The one you see on the right is a pretty interesting one. So those are free-swimming crinoids. Just to be specific, they don't actually swim on their own. This isn't powered swimming. They drift alongside sea currents. And they have this bag of gas that keeps them propped up in the water column and allows them to move around the place. We have also Cthulhu, Solasinia Cthulhu. I don't think I have to explain why it was called like that. This is a relative of a sea cucumber. Tons of appendages, very intimidating, 3 centimeters wide, deadly animal. And the boy that I mentioned previously, Jackalopterus, the larger Eurypterid sea scorpion in the time period. Here you can see roughly how it could have looked like hunting some fish. So it just grab them with those appendages and just move them to its mouth to nom them. Although, just to be accurate, it also didn't have a jaw. It would use those appendages to rip the prey apart and move smaller chunks into its mouth. We also have more fish, more armored fish without mouths, like Quilinu and Pteraspis. Pretty interesting, Pteraspis with those spikes, probably for some defensive measures, but maybe also to dig in the sediment to look for some food. We have more weird fish. Those are bottom-dwelling fish. So you can see that all of them have those jawless mouths at the top of their heads. The way they fed is speculated to look a little bit like this. So they would burrow themselves in the ground and they would wait for prey to pass by them, and then they would probably jump out and try to swallow it whole. In the Silurian, we also have great innovation, the one that I teased you about earlier. So jaws. This is the first jawed fish that we know of, Entelognathus. It is not very big, very small animal, but a jaw is a great adaptation. So when you have small trilobites, you can finally bite through the shell. Animals that have a spine, you can bite through it also. You can bite through arthropod armor. Even though it's not big, it is one of the most successful predators of its era. There are bigger fish following right after it, also in the Silurian, a little later in the time period, like the Megamastex. This one is a little bigger. It is in fact the largest Silurian fish. Like I said, the apex predators are still eurypterids, so sea scorpions. So those fish, even though they compete, they can't really break out of that niche, out of the domination of the eurypterids. They are the ones who dominate. Um, Jaws are very bad news for trilobites. You might remember that they got hit very badly in the Ordovician. Half of them went extinct. They get impacted very badly in the Silurian also. You can see some of their fossils here showing bite marks, so pieces of armor bitten off by fish that would prey on them. You can see clearly that the fish were much smaller than them, but it didn't matter. This is what I said, that jaw was a powerful weapon in the Silurian. And I want to show you this picture. This is of course not scientific in a sense that there were no humans on the sci-fi boats there, but this is a piece of art made by a paleontologist for his paper, and he wanted to portray how the Silurian could have looked like. So people who say this was a boring time period, I don't get it. It's a super colorful time with lots of cool scorpions, jellyfish, colorful sponges, corals, crinoids. You have those cephalopods sticking out of the water with their butts and swimming around. You have weird fish, some weird life on the surface with those huge fungi. It is actually pretty awesome. And at this point, I also want to recommend you something to read. This is a bit different from the other book recommendations. I want to stop at this for a moment because this is not a scientific book. This is a set of stories. This is science fiction. It was written by a guy named Stephen Atlee. Let me write down the title because I want you to remember this one. So, the Silurian Tales. And this is a set of stories. It has an overarching plot. There was a portal discovered to the Silurian era, and people go there as essentially as a scientific mission to explore it. And those stories are very loosely connected. Each of them tells a little bit different story. It's less focused on animals, more on the people, but it's a very good read. Unfortunately, the author is not among us anymore. He didn't survive the fight with cancer, so he's not writing more of them, but his stories were published in those two tomes. And personally, as far as prehistoric fiction goes, this is one of my favorites. So I highly recommend it, even though the science in it is a little outdated. Now, we get to the end Silurian, and what needs to be said at this point is that at the end Silurian, the domination of eurypterids is still in place, even though they are starting to suffer a little bit because those extinction events that I mentioned, they were hitting them pretty badly, so fish are starting to compete a little bit. And so we enter the Devonian, and Devonian is known as the age of fish. This is where the fish and animals with a spine, so chordates or vertebrates, will first ascend to the top of the food chain. So those are our relatives and our ancestors that we are talking about. And let's start by talking about some of the animals in the Devonian. On the left, you still have some trilobites surviving. This one is pretty interesting. It actually has a gripping appendage that it used to probably grip some prey or manipulate maybe some animals out of their shells. On the right, Brinda belaspis, what is called a platypus fish. I don't know if Moa is still with us, but I thought he would find this one interesting. It had the weird flat beak-like structure on its mouth that it might have used to dig in the seabed. Sorry guys, I need I need to take a sip of tea because my throat is getting dry. Here, Moa. You can see it at the bottom right. So this thing, this fish lived 409 million years ago, and it's interesting because technically it is still alive today. So Latimerias are a group of species that are incredibly ancient. This is one of the animals we call the Lazarus taxa, or the living fossils. So scientists actually used to think that Latimerias were extinct. Last fossils that we found of them were a few 100 million years ago, and then nothing in the fossil record. And suddenly one guy sees one on a fish market in the Philippines. And imagine being a paleontologist and seeing what is essentially a living T-Rex being cut into pieces and sold for sushi. So he immediately bought the fish. He shared the news with his friends, and yeah, it was discovered that Latimerias live in the deep ocean in cave systems nowadays. So they have survived for 400 million years since that time. There are some other fish. Latimeria isn't armored, but those are. So you can see a few of them here. Some pretty weird, like especially the one at the top left with its eyes facing strictly forward. What you see on the bottom left is maybe not the best piece of art, but it actually shows one of the last anomalocarids. So they will go extinct in the Devonian. So relatives of anomalocarids, predatory shrimp, will go extinct at the end of this period. What we also have on the top left is the earliest evidence of live birth in the animals, mother PCs, so mother fish, translated to English. Antarctilamna is one of the earliest shark relatives, and Doriaspis, it's just fucking weird, guys, okay? I just love the picture. I have no idea how it used those spikes that it had, but it looks freaking awesome. There is more experimentation with the body shape for the cephalopods, so you can see the shell it has been closed. There aren't almost any with a straight shell. There are a few species surviving, but not that many. And what is a very important animal that I don't have a good picture of, but is very relevant to this story, is Dipnorhynchus. So I don't have a picture, but I have a model, and I have some plushies. This is the most famous fish that you have never heard of. It's a lungfish. So it's a fish that breathes atmospheric air. There is enough air in the atmosphere in the middle Devonian that some vertebrates are starting to poke their heads out of the water. So for insects it was a little easier even when there was less oxygen because they breathe with their whole body, and as long as the body remains small they can survive on very little oxygen. For vertebrates it's a little trickier. So this is the beginning of the evolutionary line of four-legged animals. There is something else that is interesting in the Devonian, which is we arrive at the beginning of what is called the hexapod gap. And what the hexapod gap is a period between what is maybe the earliest discovery of a flying insect, which might be this, and then next discovery of the next one in the fossil record. And between those two, there is 60 million years. And reality is, scientists aren't sure if what they are looking at on the left here is a flying insect or not. They are definitely there 60 million years later. But if this is in fact a flying insect, what about all that stuff in between, right? This is what the hexapod gap is. It is a gap in the knowledge about the evolution of flight in the invertebrate animals. We don't know how insects started to fly because none of them did until this point. Now, another innovation is that vertebrates start getting big in the Devonian. Fish start growing, and one of those big ones is Heterosteus. You can see it here. There are two theories about what kind of feeding behavior it had. One postulates that it might have been a filter feeder, another that it might have been a very big burrowing fish that will actually hide itself in the sediment and ambush animals from the ground. And here's the thing, when you have big prey, you get big predators. And so you get one of the more famous ones, I would say, Dunkleosteus, also known as the guillotine fish. And here we arrive at that other group of armored fish that I told you about previously. So they are called the placoderms. So jawed armored fish. And what you're looking at here, those teeth, aren't actually teeth. Those are pieces of its skull. It has skull extended into those bone teeth-like protrusions. You will see it a little better in a moment, but first I want to show you the size of this boy. So it grew up to 10 meters long. It used those teeth to essentially, uh, well, like a guillotine, to slice off a piece of the body of its prey. You can see the skeleton here. The armor is really freaky. You can see it has armor in its freaking eyes, which is very useful because at this time, if you wanted to dive deep, a structure that would strengthen your eye would have been very useful to combat the pressure. And you can see here first how complex the skull is. It has lots of separated elements, and I will tell you in a moment why that's relevant. And you can see those plates that look like teeth. Here is a guy taking a selfie with it. It's one of its discoverers. You can see the size compared to a human. We would have easily been able to open this jaw and bite off a piece of human torso. So incredibly dangerous animal. And I want to tell you a little more about it. So first, you know the size, up to 10 meters long. The fact that the top of the skull is a separate bone allowed the scientists to discover by analyzing how the muscles must have attached to it, that it was able to open both the top and the bottom of its mouth. I don't know if any of you are eating right now, but you can take a moment to see which parts of your jaw you actually move, and you move only the bottom part. We aren't actually able to move the top of our jaw on its own. Only the bottom part of our jaws moves. This thing could open both. And why is it relevant? Because it could make this biting move very quickly. Again, by analyzing what was likely its musculature, scientists were able to calculate the speed at which it could have opened and closed its mouth, what is essentially the fastest bite in the animal kingdom. That speed of the bite created another thing. Because it opened so fast, exchange of pressure happened. So the water rushed into its mouth, and when it did that, it pulled whatever prey was in front of it with the water. So it opening its mouth meant that the prey trying to escape from it was starting to get pulled to it. So incredibly efficient system. Bite force around 6,000 newtons, about 7.2 at the guillotine tip. This isn't as much as crocodiles do today, but would it really matter for you? No, it wouldn't. And a little fact about its armor, about 5 centimeters thick. One thing to say before we move on from the Devonian and away from this little boy is that that bony armor wouldn't have been exposed necessarily. Those pieces of art are a little sensational. It would likely have been covered in skin, and only the teeth would have been exposed. Another fish worth mentioning here, also the Devonian, pretty big Titaniactis, is also a placoderm, but this one is actually not a predator. This was a filter feeder. So this is a close relative of Dunkleosteus that was not in fact an apex predator. Now, we move on to a different kind of fish. This thing is called Tiktaalik, and you can see it looks a little different. The reason why it does is because it's semi-aquatic. So Tiktaalik is one of the first fish that started moving out of water onto the surface. Most of its life was still spent in water, but it was actually capable of traversing between various pieces of water. So, for example, there's one lake and it wanted to move to another one. And Manson, I agree, it is actually pretty cute, I think. Here you can see the comparison of Tiktaalik on the left to a different animal, Acanthostega. Just FYI, this group of animals is called tetrapods. So tetrapods are our ancestors, and they are the ancestors of all current land vertebrate animals. So this is the very beginning of it. It's not correct to call it a fish, but it's not correct to call it an amphibian either. And after Acanthostega, we get Ichthyostega, and at the moment where the Ichthyostega get out of the water, the world is green. So a lot of stuff has happened on the surface. Since the Silurian until the late Devonian, the plants have diversified. The vascular plants, so the descendants of Cooksonia, have grown tremendously, and we have a green planet. And yeah, this is the world that our ancestors emerged into. You can see here Ichthyostega again with the backdrop of some land plants present here. Some of them you can see here. They are pretty interesting, very simple. And what you see on the right, Archaeopteris, is pretty interesting because While it looks like a normal tree, it's not. It's actually a fern. So it doesn't have proper leaves. Those branches are actually miniature ferns growing out of the twigs. So there's still quite a way to go to a tree in the way that we understand it. Trees actually create something else because tree trunks and root systems are very stable and strong. They can actually stabilize river systems. Until this point, water was moving just all over the place. The rivers were very short-lived and wouldn't stay in one place for long. But now that the edges of the rivers, right, are a little strengthened, the ecosystems in them can stabilize, and we get lots more freshwater animals, freshwater fish that you can see here, an example of a few species. And just to give you an idea of the balance of power here, even though this is shallow with water, it doesn't mean that those tetrapods can actually vie for domination with the fish. You can see on the bottom right there is a fish hunting some of them. And I think it's best explained with this fish. This is Hyneria, and it is the largest fish at the end of the Devonian after Dancleosteus. The reason why this one is more relevant to us is because it can actually yeet itself out of the water just so slightly and try to capture whatever tetrapod was trying to escape. So a pretty intimidating animal. And oh, I actually lost a picture of its size. I apologize. It's about 7 meters long, so still a pretty big animal. Reading recommendation, again, I will be making lots of those today. Gaining ground, this is the history of your ancestors getting out of the water at the end of the Devonian. Speaking of the end of the Devonian, it's time to talk about killing things. And Devonian does it very well. Sorry. So, and Devonian extinction is chronologically second of the Great Five. It's actually a pretty interesting one. Like the Silurian, it's actually a series of major events. Well, I've written here that some of them are minor, but this is a cyclical series of lots of annoying things happening at the end of the Devonian. But there are a few culprits. One is climate change. It got a little colder, so again, sea level drop. Volcanism, likely poisoning the water and the atmosphere a little. And the biggest culprit of it all are actually trees. So what happens is that roots release, they dig into the rock and they dislodge a lot of minerals into the water. And as those minerals get dislodged and they flow down the rivers into the ocean, they provide nutrients that help algae and bacteria bloom. So the water gets toxic. And since most of life, those fish and the early tetrapods are located in the oceans and in the seas at that time, that is very bad news. All armored fish die off at the end of the Devonian. So Dancleosteus and its relatives disappear. Vertebrates are very hard hit. Only freshwater amphibians survive. I wrote amphibian here. I should have written tetrapod. This is my bad. So there were tetrapods that were ocean-dwelling animals. After the Devonian, only freshwater ones. And overall, 75% of all species die out. However, life does pretty good after that. Because in the Carboniferous, those plants, even though they have almost killed everything, they do just excellent. Carboniferous is my favorite period of the Paleozoic. So you can see that the whole world is covered in plant life. Once plants got out of the water, once trees started innovating on how to pump water upwards, they started spreading everywhere. And I do mean everywhere. Like the carboniferous polar forests are some of the things we find at that time period. You need to remember that at this time it is much warmer than it is today. So they could have grown there without much problem. You can see here how some of those tree systems could have looked like. There was lots of shallow water systems, so there are actually lots of marshlands and swamps and all that stuff. Now, what I want to do now, which streamer and Terranes know what's coming because they saw it before. I want to take you for a walk through one of those forests. So I will put up a picture to just so I can just prepare something for a few minutes. Give me, well, not a few minutes, I need just a minute to prepare it. I will fire up and up, and then we will go on a walk through the Carboniferous swampland. Just let it load, guys. This app isn't exactly the most optimized, so give it just a few seconds. Please don't fail me, computer, please. Yes, it's loading. Okay, just one moment. Like this, and let me see. Here we are. Can you hear it? I hope that means yes. So let's go for a walk. First, you see there are lots of ferns here, right? We don't. Yeah, Manson. So this is a very basic app. There were some college students that were actually trying to make it a full-fledged Carboniferous simulator. They stopped at version 0.1. So there are no animals here, but there are plants, which is specifically what I want this app for, because I want to start talking about plants before I start talking about animals. So again, no grass, a lot of ferns. You can see them here. There are also these weird things. They are relatives of what we call horsetails that we have today. You can see some trees have fallen here. This isn't a palm tree. There are no palms here. Palms will not appear until the Cretaceous. This is again a relative of ferns, so a fern tree. We'll move past this place and we'll go to what is a little bit of an open area, a lake, so I can have a better look. And I will start by talking about this. So a piece of wood, right? A primitive tree trunk laying in the water. Why am I pointing this out? What is so interesting about it? Well, the interesting part is that it didn't decompose. The reason why trees are doing so well and have grown so widespread in the Carboniferous is because there are no fungi and no bacteria that can digest them. Nothing can decompose what is essentially wood at this point. So when it falls, it just lies around. It accumulates. There are lots of peat bogs where this thing just lies around. And this period, Carboniferous, the reason why it's called Carboniferous is after the word carbon, so coal. This is where we get most of our coal from. So all this plant life depositing and not decomposing and just compressing into geological layers, geological strata, is where you get your coal from today. Now that we have talked about it, I will do something different. I will take flight and I will talk about some other plants. So first, look at this. You have a tree with what looks like very primitive pine cones, right? And what is interesting is that there is this very symmetrical split into two parts. This is a thing you see with most of plants in this time period. Like you can see it with this one as well. There is a tree trunk and it splits into two parts. So those branch systems are very simple. You can see all of that. They are not very high resolution, but those are pine cones as well. What is also interesting is that those are called scale trees. You can see those weird trunks, and each of those scales is actually a place where a branch used to grow out of. The way they grow is they get a branch, they grow a new branch, and an older branch falls off. And that's how those scales get formed. What is interesting about them is that, sorry, wrong direction. Those trees, so this tree that with that split, is the same as this one. So the one that looks like a pine. This is a juvenile of this one. Its name is Lepidodendron. So this is probably one of the most famous Carboniferous trees. You probably know it as a scale tree. We also have those things, pretty big. It is a calamite. Again, relative of the horsetails that we get today. But yeah, this is how the Carboniferous looked like. I will show you one more view that I really like. Let's make it an evening to make it a little cooler. So the whole planet was covered in those vast early forests, quite primitive, with lots of swampland. And now it's time to talk about what lived there. So I will go back to my waiting screen for a moment. I will turn off the app and I will go back to the presentation. I hope you like this walk. Is it showing up? Sorry. Oh, here we are. Okay, just let me go back here. So we will start in the water before we move on to the land. What you have dominating in the Carboniferous oceans as the apex predator are sharks. So you know sharks. This is actually a pretty good time for them. After the placoderms and Ankylosis and its relatives have died out, this is the form of life that has rose up in their place. Sharks are a super old life form. They actually emerged before trees did. So even though this is where they come into prominence as a lineage, they were present much longer. There are some others, and some of them are pretty weird, like the Bandringa on the right side is a freshwater shark with this weird paddle that it had on its nose. On the left, you can see that lots of sharks in this time period have spikes or just weird sort of ornaments also. Probably the most famous one is this one. This is Stethacanthes. In reality, nobody really knows what it used those weird growths on its head and its fin for. There are lots of ideas, but it's like nothing else that we have seen nowadays, so it's pure speculation. It is a pretty small boy, though, so I'll be honest, if we could have them today, I would like one. We also have lots of other stuff in the oceans, of course. There are still tons of crinoids. Trilobites are still alive. They aren't doing very well. Those jaws are really messing with them. We have some cephalopods, some straight-shelled, some with the curved shells, smaller fish, corals, gastropods. All that good stuff is present here too. Some of them you can see here. So one of the last straight-shelled cephalopods. And a weird boy like the Tulimostrum. This is a weird thing because nobody knows what it's related to. Might as well be an alien. There are lots of arguments about it. Tulimostrum is actually pretty small. It's like the size of your hand. And we have this. On the surface, we have a flying insect. If you will remember the hexapod gap, this is where it ends. So this is where we get actually the first confirmed flying insect. And what is interesting is that the Schala, which is how this animal is called, is a fairly complex creature. It has 6 wings, so a fairly complex locomotion system. And yet, between that early find in the Devonian and this, for 60 million years, there is nothing. So we know there needs to be something in between there that would lead to this animal. We don't know what it is. We don't know where it is. We don't know where insects got their wings from. This is one of the bigger mysteries in the paleontology. But somewhere there, as I have written here, is the animal responsible for mosquitoes today. So fuck it. And yeah, no solid clues to the evolution of flight and insects. Speaking of insects, let's talk about the famous ones. You may have heard about Meganura. It is the largest insect in the Carboniferous. And boy, is it big. It gets this big because when you get so many trees, you get a ton of oxygen in the atmosphere. There's a lot of it. It's, if I remember correctly, I don't want to lie, it was 20 something or 30 something percent, but a lot, okay? And as you might remember, I said earlier that insects could get out of land even when there was little oxygen because they were small, right? They didn't need much oxygen because they breathe with their whole bodies. But when you get a lot of oxygen, that means insects can grow to sizes that we don't see nowadays. And this is what you get here. Carboniferous is dominated by insects that are much larger than what you get today. And Meganura is the largest flying insect of the period. And the group of animals it belongs to are not actually dragonflies per se. They are called griffin flies, so ancestors of dragonflies and their relatives. There are bigger insects around too. They don't fly. Here you see in this picture, right here, Arthroplura, which is creepy crawly, the size of 2 meters long, Here is a Gen Z tourist taking a selfie with one. I'll be honest, this probably isn't dangerous to him. At least the danger doesn't come from Arthropleura. We don't actually know whether it was predatory or whether it ate fungi or plants, because what didn't get fossilized are its mouth parts. We don't know how its jaw looked like, so it is hard to say whether it would have been a threat to this person or not. Size-wise, I think models work better than pictures. So you can see here two guys next to Arthropleura. Which streamer? Man, yeah, Skater Boy. I don't know if I would like to try, but it's actually speculated that it was pretty hardy because of how big it was. The material out of which its plates were made had to be a little stronger than what insects use today. So this was a different form of kitten. So it might have actually supported you. Here are some other insects present in the Carboniferous. So just for the record, Meganeuropsis is not actually a Carboniferous animal. It's actually early Permian. We'll talk about it a little later. On the bottom left, what you see is the largest cockroach ever. Fuck that thing. And largest land scorpion, Pulmonoscorpius. And Arthropleura on the right. Just amazing animals. This is one of my favorite pictures. Pulmonoscorpius. The artist here is Mark Witten. Let me write down his name in the Twitch chat. The guy has a Patreon for $5 per month. You can get access to all his art, and it's really just fucking amazing. So you can see here Pulmonoscorpius in the Carboniferous forest in the evening during the rain, and there is a small early tetrapod trying to run away from it. Here you see a proud father feeding one. And what you see here on the bottom right is a Hibertopterus. What Hibertopterus is the last Eurypterid, last of the sea scorpions. And this one is actually a freshwater one. And it's not a predator this time. It's just chills on the surface. It's a scavenger, most likely. It ate whatever it could find. Quite a sizable animal too. Now, aside from insects, other things that are doing pretty well in the Carboniferous are amphibians, and those are true amphibians. At this point, amphibians and tetrapods live side by side here. So Anthracosaurus I'm confusing it with Anthracanthrosaurus, which is a dinosaur. It's about 3 meters long. So is Eriops. So maybe not humongous animals, but they would have been able to bite you pretty bad. To me, the scariest one is this one, Crassigyrinus. It's a small-bodied animal with a huge freaking head and terrifying teeth. I wouldn't like to dip my feet or whatever else into the water with those things around. One of the more interesting amphibians is Platyhystrix. You will see lots of animals with those sails on their back. Reality is we aren't sure as to their role. There are two leading theories, well, three really. One, that it was used for thermoregulation, so it could capture heat and dissipate it well. The other, it could have been used for mating season, and third, it could have been used for communication. But really, we aren't sure. We also have the wiener dogs of the Carboniferous, the microsaurs. They are not dinosaurs, of course. They are not reptiles. Also, they are very early amphibians. And that noodly body shape gets translated further. Those are also not snakes. Like I said, nothing is original in the evolution. Those are also amphibians that have developed a snake body plan long before snakes emerged on the planet Earth later in the time of the dinosaurs. And we have what I think is my favorite Carboniferous animal, Rhizodus, which is the largest freshwater fish of all time and actually the apex predator of those waters. Here is the size composition next to an animal waifu because I couldn't find a better one. It was about 8 meters long. And just like Hyneria in the Devonian, it had those powerful fleshy fins that would have allowed it to jump out of the water and follow its prey just a little bit. We also have what are first amniotes. And what is an amniote, some of you may ask? Amniote is an animal that has some kind of cover around its eggs. so it can deposit eggs and it can breed outside of water. That might make you think about reptiles, of course, and mammals and birds and all that stuff. What needs to be said here, so that just so it's clear, our evolutionary line starts here. What you see on the left, Archaeotheris, is an early synapsid. The animal on the right, Petrolaccosaurus, is a diapsid. And just so it's clear, because I know there is this myth going around online that we are descended from reptiles. We are not. Reptiles are our close relatives. Reptiles are descendants of diapsids. Diapsids lead to birds, reptiles, dinosaurs, crocodiles, all that stuff. Synapsids, our lineage, lead to mammals and our relatives that are extinct now, but which we'll talk about in a moment. So that talk about us having a reptile brain or something is just bullshit. We never had reptiles in our evolutionary line, nor, for the record, did we have amphibians. Synapsids don't have amphibians in their ancestry. So the true amphibians that we talk about are called, actually, a group is called Lysamphibia. So this is a third evolutionary line that devolved from tetrapods. So while we are tetrapods, and amphibians are tetrapods, and diapsids are tetrapods, we are not amphibians and we are not reptiles. The only of the major animal kingdoms that we actually share common ancestry with are fish. We are fish in a very rudimentary sense. So I hope that clears it up. Moving on, let's talk about some of those early branching animals. Hylonomus is the earliest reptile we know. Pretty basic animal, a little small, roughly the size of your forearm. Witch streamer. Yes, that's very accurate. And especially if you talk about cavemen, which, in a very simplistic term, people sometimes by cavemen mean Neanderthals, right? Neanderthals are not our ancestors either, nor, as it turns out, are our sister species. They're actually more cousins than siblings to us. Another one is a carbon Draco. And you might see I have added a word parareptile here. So reptiles actually had a sister group at that time, a sister group which didn't survive until today. They were called parareptiles, very much like reptiles, but not actually. We won't get too deep to talk about them today. But one of them is very interesting. Dendromaya is actually the earliest fossil evidence of maternal care in vertebrates. So it was found in a single place with evidence of taking care of its babies. Now, we talked about diapsids. Let's talk about synapsids, so our ancestors. One of the earliest ancestors of ours is Ophiacodon, you can see here. Still looking very reptile amphibian-like, but let's remember, it's not either. And Edaphosaurus, which is one of my favorite carboniferous animals. You might think that this is similar to Dimetrodon, and you would be right. It's one of its relatives. So Edaphosaurus, again, the sail. Again, we aren't sure what it was exactly used for. Edaphosaurus was cute as fuck. I imagine this is one of my favorite pieces of art of this boy. A little small head, but I think that's what makes it cuter even more. Carboniferous as a whole, I did say this is my favorite time period in the Paleozoic. Those pictures that I will show you now, I think, exemplify it. You can see it's very diverse. There is not a single life form dominating. Like in the Devonian, we had fish. In the Silurian, we had sea scorpions. Before that, we had cephalopods and shrimp. Right? Here, there are massive insects. There are massive amphibians. There are early tetrapods of other kinds. There are big fish in the water. All this life lives in an equilibrium on a planet covered fully by trees. And this picture, it's kind of cutesy, but I really like it. It shows really this life in its totality. Very diverse, a little shy, covered by the shadow of those widespread trees, not quite ready to meet the sun. Most of those animals were not able to venture far from the water, with the exception of very early synapsids and diapsids, right? But it is about to be faced with lots of sun. But we'll talk about this in a moment. Again, reading recommendation. If you want to read about it a little more, you can read about the Carboniferous and the extinction at the end of it in the book on the left. And if you like plants, books on the right. Now, what happens at the end of the Carboniferous? We have so-called Carboniferous rainforest collapse, and it is a minor extinction event. Another one. This one is pretty interesting. So, first of all, what it will lead to is the vast reduction in the spread of the global forests. As the Carboniferous ends, those global rainforests shrink and they only remain as a few isolated islands of greenery in the whole world. Contributing factors are multiple. First, there is a very small ice age at the end of the Carboniferous. It's a short one, but this was a tropical world, so it impacts it quite badly. The other, if you will remember, there are high oxygen levels in the Carboniferous, which means everything is flammable. When there is a storm, fucking everything burns. So lots of forests just go out with smoke. Wood-eating fungi and wood-eating microbes evolve. So there are finally things that are able to digest wood, and they devastate the Carboniferous forests. And finally, there's the formation of the supercontinent of Pangaea. So the continents lock together, they disrupt the flow of the air and of the sea currents, and the center of the supercontinent becomes a vast desert. And desert is not good for plants, as you might imagine. Result, after you lose so many plants, the oxygen starts to collapse to more manageable levels. The environment becomes much more arid. As the oxygen starts to decrease, this heralds the beginning of the extinction of the giant land insects. They are still present at the beginning of the Permian, but not for long. Amphibians, tetrapods, animals that need water to survive, the range of their habitats is decreased. And so we enter a different world, the last period of the Paleozoic era, the Permian period. This is 50 million years of Earth not being a friendly place. It is super dry, very arid. It was great to be a plant in the Carboniferous. It is not so in the Permian. What you can see here is a listosaur. We'll talk about this animal before we finish today. You can see here Pangaea joined together. The world here presented here is actually greener than it looks. This is still remnants of that ice age. You can see on the southern pole there is some ice covering, but the Permian will get super hot before the period is over. There will be no ice whatsoever. You can see the vast desert on the continent. The whole place is pretty dry and devoid of water and forest coverage. That said, there are some forests out there. You can see them here. They are just very sparse. And here we have this other griffinfly that I mentioned before, Meganeuropsis is its name. This one is actually the largest known insect, largest flying insect. Comparison size here, Ripley is the best person to handle this, so she is present in the picture. And here you see on the right a comparison with some of the living insects today. We also have some amphibians. They mostly got decimated at the end of the Carboniferous, but Diplocalus is an interesting one. There is a speculation saying that it lived in streams with strong current and that it used this wide head to lift itself up as the water was flowing by it. It was a very energy efficient process. Here is another picture of this boy. Pretty cool. Now, in the Permian, this is actually the largest Permian animal. It's 9 meters long. It's Prionosuchus. This is not a crocodile. This is an amphibian that just has adopted crocodilian body plan. Again, nothing in evolution is original. Crocodilian body plan will be evolved 4 times throughout the history by 4 different groups of animals. This is the first instance of that. So Prionosuchus is a big animal. It is an apex predator, but remember, in the Permian, you get very few forests, very few wetlands, so its spread around the planet is very small. So it's not a dominant animal at all. One of the animals that do better are those parareptiles that I mentioned previously, so cousins to the reptilian. And what we owe the Permian is the invention of the dad body, which you can see here. Parasaurs are what is essentially Earth's first megafauna. So there are quite massive creatures. On the top right, you can see a shadow of a person next to them. And what is interesting is they are the first land armored animals. You can see some body armor present on it here. Size, about 3 meters long, 1.5 meters tall. What is interesting is that scientists speculate there were actually decent swimmers in spite of their size. Buoyancy is a big factor in water locomotion. So this kind of body plan, that rounded body, would have been quite helpful. Speaking of water, in the water you still have some surviving trilobites. You can see one on the bottom left. Cephalopods, sharks are still the dominant life. And what you have on the right is the first instance of a terrestrial animal transitioning back into the water environment. This is a mesozoar, not to confuse with a mosasaur, because in the Cretaceous later you have mosasaurs, which will be those massive oceanic reptiles. This is a different kind of animal, much smaller. And here are the last four known trilobite species. The journey they went on throughout the whole Paleozoic is coming to an end. They aren't doing so hot in the Permian. What is interesting is this. What you are looking at is a piece of a skeleton of a shark. And scientists found it next to a shark body. And they tried over years to discover how it would fit with it. And they came up with some interesting ideas. So first it was attached to it like this. Some have proposed that it's actually a part of a weird fin and a defensive measure. Others suggested the shark might have had a proboscis of this kind and used it to capture other animals. After some trial and error, they have arrived to how it looked actually, which is this. This spiral actually went inside the body, and as the shark was using its teeth, it was essentially unraveling and moving new teeth to the front in place of the old ones. And this kind of jaw was actually great at crunching through shells of cephalopods. Yeah, Ben, I love this animal too. There were other sharks that used this jaw system, like the shark that you see on the top left. There were fish, more cephalopods, although far from the Ordovician titans that we used to have. And what we have are the first flying vertebrates in the Permian. Just to be clear, this is not powered flight. Those are gliders. So those are gliding reptiles, not lizards yet. There are no proper lizards at this point in the Permian yet. And what is interesting, that the very first invention of gliding in the vertebrates is still alive today. So this system of extending spines and having like a fold between them, you can see the spines here. This is one spine, second, third, fourth. There are multiple spines holding up this wing, sort of. It's a system that is still used today by some reptiles. Now, let's talk about our relatives. Let's talk about synapsids, because even though there are reptiles and relatives of reptiles in the Permian, they are not the bosses. We are. This is the time of our ancestors, and the synapsids go on to dominate the Permian land. So you might have heard about Dimetrodon before. It used to be that lots of people were associating it with dinosaurs, and it was often like its toys and animations were showing it together. It was not a dinosaur. It didn't live next to dinosaurs. It was also not a reptile. It is a synapsid. It is one of our early relatives, a group called pelycosaurs. So Dimetrodon was actually a genus. There were lots of Dimetrodon species, as you can see them here. I just want to say that both this picture and those aren't necessarily accurate, because they still portray Dimetrodon as more of a reptile than a mammal ancestor, like a very widespread legs, bald skin, and in reality it was probably moving around a little differently. You can see the legs more firmly under its torso. It was probably a faster animal, capable of more dynamic movement, if not running, the way mammals will do later, rather than have this swaying movement of a reptile. And other things that need to be added is that the sail actually had protruding spikes, which is not often shown. The body again was lifted, and the mouth probably had more mammal-like shape, maybe even some whiskers or stuff like that. This is our ancestor, not an ancestor of reptiles that we have today. Other interesting animals living in the Permian. This is one of early. I'm actually not sure if this is a diapsid or synapsid. I think this is actually on the reptilian side of things. Cotylorhynchus. Interesting because of a very small head. Also semi-aquatic. Those boys are actually our very close relatives. Even within synapsids, there are some that are related to us more closely or more distantly. Dicynodonts are essentially proto-mammals with beaks. You can see here they have tusks and a beak-like structure at the top of their nose. So those are our cousins, very close ones. And this one is called Bulbasaurus, allegedly not after Pokemon at all. I don't know how much truth is that. Overall, most of synapsids belong to the group called Therapsida. So Therapsids are a dominant group of synapsids in the Permian. I know there are lots of psids in this, but Permian animals aren't generally very well known, so it's probably why you didn't hear about most of them. Megawaithia is about the size of a bear, so it is one of the apex predators at that time. It was probably a little fuzzy. Again, not a mammal, very far from being one, but not a reptile either. Synapsid. Another one is Pristerognathus, probably a tree-dwelling synapsid. Moschops, which is a chunky boy, a little weird looking, actually an herbivore, very strong animal most likely, also a synapsid. Another therapsid synapsid is Estemenosuchus. What needs to be said about this one is that those weird structures on its head, scientists and artists have a tendency to shrink wrap animal bones. We don't actually know if there were some fleshy structures between those bones, protruding out of its head. So this reconstruction might actually change in the future as our knowledge expands. However, the Permian apex predators were those synapsids. So a group of synapsids called gorgonopsids. And gorgonopsids are the first saber-teeth animals in the geological record. You can see those saber teeth. You can see this thing is a little more mammal-like. It is closer to us than some of the other therapsids you saw before. And what were the differences? Well, first of all, they didn't thermoregulate as well as we did. They laid eggs still at this point. Their fur was probably less prominent than ours. They couldn't chew. Their jaws were working like those of a reptile. They didn't have ears. They only have, those ear holes. They needed to bask in the sun more than mammals currently do to thermoregulate. And they just weren't as dynamic, right? So it's still a long way to go into a fully mammalian form. But when you, here is the size, 3 meters long, and a comparison with a man. When you look at it, even though this reconstruction doesn't have much fuzz on it, you can see that the nose is quite mammal-like. Here it is, chasing after some Dicynodonts. It's kind of like a cat almost here. And here, this is a completely cat-like behavior, just basking in the sun and in the sand. For the record, some of them were smaller, like the tree-dwelling Lycaenops. This one is just, it's a cat. It's a cat. Some of the others, like Suminia, were also here. So Suminia is a synapsid, so our relative. Eorosaurus is not. It's a reptile. So there were some tree-dwelling animals here too. And what is super interesting about Suminia is that over 200 million years ago, 250 specifically, this thing already has opposable thumbs. So the things that are strictly associated with great apes and primates, that are supposedly one of the things responsible for our intelligence, are already invented by synapsids this far away. Here you can see it reeing at one of the gorgonopsids. What about us though? Because all those things that I show you are not our ancestors, they are our relatives. We belong to a group of synapsids called the cynodonts. And this is one of our ancestors, Dvinia prima. It's a very small animal, about the size of a forearm. It is a burrowing animal. Another one of our relatives is Procinosuchus. This is one of the earliest semi-aquatic mammals. So we actually started expanding into the water as well at this point. So our ancestors were really widespread around the in the Permian. So it looked like the world was ours for the taking. Fuck dinosaurs, this is our planet, right? And then what happens is the great dying, so the end permanent extinction. So what happens? There is volcanism. And volcanism on its own is not very unique, right? But what you need to remember is that Pangaea just formed. So lots of continental plates are mushing together and squishing, and there's lots of lava flowing out. This isn't just a volcanic eruption. This is a flow of the size of Siberia. So this is a huge lake of lava spread around the planet. And what is a bigger problem is that it has a lot of fuel. If you will go back to the Carboniferous, you will remember there were lots of trees there that got deposited and created vast coal deposits, way more coal than what we have today. And when things start to burn in the Permian, they get to that coal and they start releasing it and gets super toxic because coal isn't good. Coal, when it burns, it releases CO2. All that CO2 that those plants captured in the Carboniferous gets released now. So you get climate change. It gets super hot, scorching hot. So the animals have trouble thermoregulating this and they start dying off. But it gets worse because when you have super strong volcanism, you have a very strong ash layer, which means that right after it gets hot, you get nuclear winter. So first it gets hot, then it gets cold. But then you also get more CO2 emissions. So it gets hot again. And then it gets cold again. And hot again. And cold again. You have this cycle of temperature extremes going for over 1 million years. And animals just can't keep up and they can't adapt to those changes happening at this pace. Evolution is a relatively slow moving process and it impacts them very badly. And this isn't the end of it. This is just the beginning of the great dying. Another thing that happens is when you release so much toxicity from the volcanoes, from the coal burning into the ocean, it turns acidic. There are lots of bacteria, lots of algae. Oxygen die-off happens in the ocean. So animals suffocate, they die, they decompose, they feed more bacteria. As the water evaporates, there is still water cycle on the planet. It is toxic, it is acidic. So what you get is acidic rain. So you get volcanism, you get fire, you get nuclear winter, you get climate change, you get climate warming, and you get acid falling from the sky and burning you. So the only place where the animals can run away from it is deep into the landmass, away from the coasts where there is no rainfall, into the desert, where it's very difficult to survive. There is another problem with this, because as the acidic rain falls, it kills plants. As plants die, they get washed back into the ocean. And as they get washed back into the ocean, there's even more die-off, because there's more fuel from the dead plants for the bacteria. So you get more acidification. You get stronger acid rains. So you get even more plants dying and back into the ocean to create more acidic rain, to kill more plants, to get them back into the ocean. It starts this loop of death on the planet that is seemingly endless. It's death on the land accelerates death in the sea. And as the planet warms, something even worse happens, if you can imagine, which is that methane starts to be released. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, and it has, aside from turning the planet into a scorching hell, it has one more very dangerous property, which is it destroys the ozone. Ozone is needed on the planet to protect us from ultraviolet radiation. So as the methane gets released, ozone starts to disappear, and the planet, devoid of tree coverage, devoid of shelter, bathed in lava and acidic rain, gets bombarded with space radiation. So it turns radioactive. So even the animals that escaped into the desert where it was already difficult to survive, they start getting hit by ultraviolet rays. What helps animals survive is a very specific adaptation. Two of them. Burrowing, so digging holes in the ground and hiding there, and hibernation. Lystrosaurus, so the animal that I showed you at the beginning, has been actually found to be capable of hibernation. Its bones were discovered and they have shown periods of prolonged stasis that indicate it would hibernate. However, this cycle, this kind of devastation continues for millions of years. And by the time it's over, the planet is almost dead. Like, what breaks the cycle is the fact that the planet runs out of trees. So the acidic rain can't find any trees to kill, and there is no more fuel to basically accelerate the acidification in the oceans, and the fires and volcanism run out of coal, run out of fuel. So at this point, the planet is a devastated world. The oceans are doing even better. There's almost no oxygen in them, and they are doing really, really bad. So what is the aftermath? It is the deadliest mass extinction of the Great Five. Trilobites go extinct. They lived the whole of Paleozoic only to die off here. All proto-mammal groups except for two go extinct. Only we survive, cynodonts, and our cousins, dicynodonts. So those things with beaks, you see them on the left here in the form of Lystrosaurus. Crinoids, so my favorites, almost go extinct. It will take them very long to bounce back. Overall, 96% of marine species die, 70% of terrestrial life, and the recovery will take about 10 million years for the biodiversity to return to pre-extinction levels. There is a silver lining to this, however, which is that so much death opens lots of new niches for life to expand to, for the evolution to experiment. And if it wasn't for the great dying, we wouldn't get this. We wouldn't get dinosaurs. The next chapter of the story is the Triassic, and it is the beginning of the story of the dinosaurs. And what about us, right? So our relatives, what about mammals? Well, dicynodonts will go on to live with us in the Triassic. They will have a pretty good run there, but they won't survive the Triassic. We will, and it will take us 160 million years until we get a second chance, until the extinction of the dinosaurs, when one of the descendants of the cynodonts, a true mammal named Purgatorius, will emerge from its burrow to retake the world and essentially give us a second chance that our ancestors in the Permian have so unjustifiably lost. And just one last reading recommendation at this point. If you like doomsday scenarios, read The Ends of the World. This is the book about the great mass extinctions. All 5 of them, really great read. Now, this is the end for today. Thank you for coming and listening. This was a long one, so over 2 hours. Next one, first of all, next week, same time, I will be talking about the Triassic because I want to record it today. So the first chapter of the story of the dinosaurs. And if you want to go ahead of time a little bit, there is a Jurassic stream recording on my YouTube. I will... I will drop you a link in just a moment if you want to watch it. Just a second. Manson, it is recording. It is recording. It is fine. It is fine. This time it's going to be all good. Give me just one moment. Okay. I need to go to my Twitch. I need to get a second screen like properly. Here. All right, let me go back to the presentation now. Just 1 second. I'm almost done, guys. Yeah, so, and after that, guys, I'm sorry, my presentation started jumping around the place. Okay, back to it. So, you can watch you can join me for the next stream on the next weekend, so October 17th, same time. You can watch Jurassic on YouTube now. And the next stream I will be doing after that is second part of the... Okay, so something broke. But the second part of the Jurassic will be on October 21st. I will remind you all, I apologize for this stubborn thing. It clearly wants me to move on to the questions if you have any. But one way or another, thank you for tuning in today. I know this was a long one, and I don't know this is a weekend, so I appreciate that my desire to record this was met with actually some viewership. So thanks again. All right, I don't see any questions at this point. I imagine that after 2 hours, lots of you are tired, and I will probably go to grab some tea also. So Thanks again for coming. I will be signing off, and I hope to see you in a week at the same time. See you around.